Gene used to invite me into his classes to give poetry readings, and then we started to talk more and more about the nature of poetry and what poets did with it, and how poets differed from the way teachers taught poetry, and quite often the kids would respond to the reading of poetry. So I said, let's teach them how to read, is really what it came down to. I wasn't at any point, at this point anyways, I'm not interested at all in writing a book. As a matter of fact, the direct opposite most of the time, you know. And you?
Well, I wasn't planning on writing a book either. I was dissatisfied with the way I was teaching poetry. It felt like something was being missing. The emotion of the poem we weren't talking about. And so when I met Fran and he started talking about the sound of poetry, that seemed to me to be a way into something I didn't understand, know about, or how to deal with. And so that's why we taught together in college level freshman courses. And that was essentially the origin. So we had to work out, what are we doing? How do you hear poems? And my concern as teacher was, how do you write about that? How do the students write about these issues? So we had to find vocabulary for this. We had to find ways of talking about it. We had to find examples that dealt with use of line and then sound and issues like that. So it was out of a dissatisfaction that I wanted to know more. And the students, as you said, the response was very positive. They understood it right away, even before we knew exactly what sorts of things we were doing.
We were faced with a whole bunch of books that we felt weren't addressing the major issues that we were covering with our students. And as a consequence, what we decided we wanted to do was to write a book that was going to literally change the direction of how poetry was to be taught. So our first and major concern in putting the book together was to make sure that the other books that were already out were not just being recapitulated in our book. So we wanted to have things that were going to happen in the book that would address those issues, like memory work, like the sound going into the body, the emotions developing through that sound, the interrelationship between the voice of the poet and the voice of the student, so that there was two levels of operation that we were talking about. One of them is the voice of the poet, and then to have the students begin to recognize that there was another voice, not to keep turning it into their own voice. So that way it would end up becoming whatever I thought about the poem was the thing that was important. We wanted them to hear the poem itself. We thought it might even improve their love life. And we mean that. Like there might be a possibility that you'd start paying attention to another person somewhere down the line, or your friends, you know, and that you didn't keep changing them into you.
Yeah, I think it's part of my, as I said, dissatisfaction with the textbooks and how I did with poetry. They didn't seem to get into issues and of emotion and so forth, and I felt there was something in there that I had to get hold of. So, and I didn't want just questions for the students that textbooks usually offer, like to identify a simile, or to identify a metaphor, to identify an image. That didn't seem to be useful, because what you need to know is, what does it do in this poem? What is image? What is an image, and how does an image work, so that you can understand the working of it in an individual poem. And so that was what kept moving us. We just didn't find what we wanted. Robert Francis' poem, The Sound I Listen For, is in our first chapter on line.
What I remember is the ebb and flow of sound that summer morning as the mower came and went and came again, crescendo and diminuendo, and always when the sound was loudest, how it ceased a moment while he backed the horses for the turn, the rapid clatter giving place to the slow click and the mower's voice, That was the sound I listened for. The voice did what the horses did. It shared the action as sympathetic magic does, or incantation. The voice hauled and the horses hauled. The strength of one was in the other, and in the strength was no impatience. Over and over as the mower made his round, I heard his voice, and only once or twice he backed and turned and went ahead and spoke no word at all.
The phrasing of the line, for instance, when he comes to how it ceased a moment, we suggest you pause, you hesitate slightly at ceased to hear that sound and moving to a moment, and that happens regularly throughout the poem. Our commentary is the first line, which draws attention to the ebb and flow of sound, would seem to be a complete sentence. So we are inclined to pause before turning to learn when the sound took place. But the sentence continues to move, so we need to pause but not break the movement of the sentence. While Francis' lines lead us forward, each line end has a distinct and different break. In line 2, quote, as the mower came and went and came again, our slight pause at and went slows the mower's action before the change and return and came again. The pause at the end of line 4 is different again because it breaks the verb from the adverb, how it ceased a moment while he backed. If we do not cease, we do not hear the moment of cessation, an important dramatizing of the mower's movement. That's pretty much a suggestive way we approach talking about the poems and how we link it to sound, to the line, and to the vocalization, because we want it to be a spoken poem, hearing and speaking poetry.
One time, Gina and I were teaching together, and I made the assignment of, okay, here is D.H. Lawrence's poem, Snake, so why don't you tell me what the rhythm is, and don't go to iambic pentameter, tell me what the real rhythm of the poem is. And we had 2 or 3 football players, and I kept saying, what's the rhythm? Everybody else went into their head. The football players went into their body, as football players have a tendency to do. And all of a sudden, as I'm reading, and he reached down from the fissure in the earth wall in the gloom, and I said, what's the rhythm of that? And everybody was still trying to think in their head, except I'd repeat it, and it says, I'd reach down from the fissure in the earth wall in the gloom, and the football players are feeling it in their body and rocking back and forth, and I said, turn around and look at those guys. You know, that's the rhythm, you know. Rhythm being that going back to the Greek term of motion, and which assumes the body and assumes that the Greek priests were coming out and literally not only saying the poem but singing it and dancing it across. That's why we still have the word foot in most rhythmic structures. It's the way the foot hits the stage. The kids got the rhythm, and as they started to watch the football players with what they were doing, and as I kept repeating, they finally, one kid says, oh, it's the snake, it's the motion of the snake. That's right, because the word motion is rhythm. That's what it's all about.
What we'd like to have is, I think, linking up with what you just said, as for a student to open up to the experience of the poem, not just the information of the poem, not just to see what's taking place, but to take on that experience, because that enlarges us, that opens us to hear other voices. It makes experience, learning about emotions, much more important, and it changes us. And that's what we hope. If you listen to poems and listen to yourself speaking poems, that I think is what is happening. You're allowing others to come in and you introduce yourself to other experiences, and that's always, I think, very valuable and an essential part of learning.